What if one of the greatest economic disasters in history didn't arrive suddenly, but quietly announced itself years in advance, while almost everyone ignored the signs? In 1929, the world believed it had entered a new financial era. Markets were booming, credit was easy, and confidence felt unshakable. Then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. Banks failed, jobs disappeared, the entire economy is frozen. What followed became known as the Great Depression. Nearly 100 years later, with today's global economy facing record debt, persistent inflation, and unpredictable markets, the question quietly returns. Are we watching history repeat itself, or something entirely new unfolding? This is the Economic Archive, and today we're not here to predict a disaster. We're here to examine the warning signs history left behind, and to ask whether the world is paying attention this time. Because financial collapses rarely come without notice. They often happen when confidence quietly breaks. To understand why the comparison to 1929 still holds weight, we need to revisit the world of the late 1920s. The Roaring Twenties were a time of rapid innovation and bold optimism. Radios entered homes, automobiles transformed cities, and stock markets soared. Consumer spending was booming, credit was widely available, and the belief in permanent prosperity was everywhere. Investing became a cultural obsession. Families with little savings were borrowing to buy shares, convinced that prices could only rise, and for a while, that belief held true. Markets climbed. Fortunes were created. Optimism turned into certainty. But underneath that confidence, trouble was growing. Banks operated with very little oversight. Many were using depositors' money to speculate in the market. Personal and corporate debt piled up. Factories produced beyond actual demand. Wages lagged far behind productivity, while wealth became increasingly concentrated. These dangers weren't hidden. They were known, but in the wave of optimism, most chose to ignore them. Risk was mistaken for opportunity. Caution was drowned out by euphoria, and by the time reality forced its way back in, it was too late. In October 1929, that reality arrived. The initial sell-off on what became known as Black Thursday was followed by even steeper declines on Black Monday and Black Tuesday. In just days, massive amounts of paper wealth disappeared. Banks that had lent recklessly began to collapse, and without deposit insurance, ordinary people lost their savings overnight. Panic spread. Businesses closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. By the early 1930s, nearly 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Red lines stretched across cities. The Great Depression wasn't just a market crash. It was a collapse of confidence that reshaped economies, governments, and lives around the world. Now consider the present day. The imagery is different, but the emotional rhythm resonates. Instead of crowds outside failing banks, we see notifications on smartphones and red graphs flashing on our screens. Over the past 15 years, the global economy has operated under extraordinary conditions. Interest rates held close to zero. Central banks injected trillions into the markets. Risk-taking became the norm, backed by an unspoken belief that central banks would always intervene if things went wrong. When the pandemic hit in 2020, governments launched the largest stimulus packages in modern history. Quickly, markets bounced back. Stocks soared to record highs. Real estate surged. New asset classes like cryptocurrencies exploded in popularity. But for millions of households, the recovery felt uneven. Wages struggled to keep pace with expenses. Home prices shot beyond reach. Debt continued to rise. Between 2021 and 2023, inflation surged across the globe. It reduced purchasing power and pressured central banks into action. Interest rates rose quickly, making it harder and more expensive to borrow. Suddenly, all the debt taken on during the good times became a heavy burden. Businesses that relied on cheap money began to feel the consequences. Cracks started appearing. High-profile bank collapses, tech sector layoffs, and a cooling housing market began to shift the mood. Meanwhile, global debt reached record highs. Households, corporations, and governments were all locked into obligations that depended on growth continuing and confidence remaining high. These are not identical to the issues of the 1920s, but the underlying tension is difficult to ignore. To be fair, today's systems are more advanced. Banks are better regulated. Deposit insurance protects customers. Central banks have more tools and move faster than they once did. Governments understand how damaging economic denial can be. These safeguards are meaningful, but resilience does not mean invincibility. And sometimes, complexity itself brings new challenges. When systems become so large and interconnected that no one fully understands how they work, even small failures can ripple into large problems. History also teaches another lesson. During the Great Depression, policymakers made several mistakes that worsened the crisis. Taxes were raised, government spending was cut, global trade stalled due to protectionist tariffs like the Smoot-Hawley Act. What began as a liquidity crisis became a prolonged economic nightmare. The lesson is simple. Bad policy at the wrong time can take a recession and turn it into something much worse. Today, many of the warning signs are different in detail, but not in principle. Corporate profits are tightening. Credit is getting more expensive. Asset valuations remain historically stretched in many sectors. Confidence, which underpins the entire financial system, has become fragile. It doesn't take systemic collapse to start panic. Just one failure in one corner of the economy can spread quickly, especially in an environment already on edge. But let's step back. The point of this is not fear, it's perspective. The real question is not whether a crash is inevitable, but whether we are prepared to respond wisely if one begins. At the Economic Archive, we don't offer predictions. We provide context, because economic breakdowns rarely come without signs. They form slowly, under the weight of habits, assumptions, and decisions made when times feel secure. Often, the belief that this time is different becomes the most dangerous idea of all. So what should this moment make us think about? It should remind us of how economic optimism can easily become overconfidence, of how debt can mask delicate systems, of how slow action can magnify the damage. The global economy today is stronger in many ways, but also stretched. The tools are more powerful, but the choices are harder. Decisions made now will echo for years, not just in financial markets, but in everyday lives, in public trust, and in what kind of future we're building. History doesn't tell us exactly what happens next, but it sharpens the questions we ask about the present. Are we facing risk with clarity, or denying it until it's too late? Are leaders confronting hard truths, or postponing them for convenience? And more simply, are we paying attention when the signs start to appear? Because when history rhymes, those who listen early are rarely surprised. If this video gave you something to reflect on, support the Economic Archive by liking and subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of money, power, and the patterns that shape our world. Drop your view in the comments. Do you believe the economy today is more resilient than in 1929? Or are we watching old patterns return in a new form? And if you know someone who's watching the markets without seeing the history, share this video with them, because sometimes understanding what came before is the best way to prepare for what comes next.